This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript, handwritten in Ethiopia's sacred liturgical language, Ge'ez. It's 52 leaves, 102 pages carefully preserved and written by the scribes who devoted their very lives to this work.
Most people think the story of Jesus ends with an empty tomb, a stone rolled away, a folded cloth, a few stunned faces standing in the morning light, and then departure, the end. But in the mountains of Ethiopia, there are manuscripts that describe what happened next. Not hours later, not days later, 40 days later, private teachings, intimate conversations. A Jesus who was not performing miracles for crowds but sitting with his closest followers and showing them how to see the world differently. For more than 1,000 years, almost nobody outside Ethiopia could read these words. Not because they were hidden, not because they were suppressed, but because they were written in a language so rare, so ancient, so completely ignored by Western scholarship, that the texts might as well have been invisible. The language is Ge'ez, and the manuscript is called the Mashafa Kidden, the Book of the Covenant. It was never banned. It was never declared heretical. It was never locked in a vault or buried in a cave. It sat in plain sight, read aloud in Ethiopian churches and monasteries for over 15 centuries, while the rest of the world looked the other way. This is not a story about suppression. It is a story about something stranger and, in some ways, more troubling. It is a story about what happens when an entire civilization's sacred library is simply never considered worth reading. That story begins not with a discovery, but with a question historians are still debating. Why did the Western world spend centuries studying Greek, Latin, and Hebrew manuscripts, and almost entirely ignore the oldest continuous Christian tradition on earth? To understand what Ethiopia preserved, you first have to understand what Ethiopia was. And most people, shaped by a particular version of history, have never been told. In the early 4th century, under King Izana of the Kingdom of Aksum, Ethiopia declared Christianity its state religion. This was not a tentative, politically cautious move. It was a full declaration, churches built, bishops ordained, sacred texts translated into Ge'ez. That declaration came at least 50 years before the Roman Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of Rome in 380 CE. Half a century. While Rome was still debating what to do with Christians, Ethiopia had already built a civilization around the faith. Think about what that timeline means. The Ethiopia that would go on to preserve manuscripts the West had never read was not a late arrival to Christianity. It was not a recipient of Roman missionary work. It was a parallel origin, a place where the faith took root independently, developed its own theological vocabulary, produced its own sacred art, and built its own relationship with the divine. And then, crucially, it was left alone. Surrounded by mountains, deserts, and distances no Roman bureaucrat was willing to cross, the Ethiopian church developed in near total isolation from the political machinery that was, simultaneously, reshaping Western Christianity from the inside out. That isolation was not a disadvantage. It turned out to be a form of protection. Because while Ethiopia was quietly copying manuscripts by hand in monastery candlelight, Rome was doing something very different. Rome was deciding which manuscripts deserved to exist at all. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE was a turning point. Not purely a spiritual gathering, a political one. An emperor who needed a unified faith convened a room full of bishops and tasked them with producing exactly that. Unity. Coherence. A single version of the story that an empire could manage. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply what empires do. They standardize. They centralize. They require that the same doctrine be taught in every province, that the same books be read in every church, that the same conclusions be drawn about the nature of God from one end of the territory to the other. The canon was the result. A list of approved texts. And a canon, by definition, means someone decides what stays and what goes. Ethiopia was never part of that conversation. It never received the order to stop reading Enoch. It never sat in a council chamber and watched politically motivated bishops vote entire books out of existence. It never had to choose between spiritual completeness and institutional approval. So it kept everything. For centuries, a single monk might spend years copying one manuscript by hand. Imagine that life. The monastery perched on a mountain where the air is thin and the silence is enormous. The day organized around prayer, fasting, and the slow, deliberate work of preservation. A mistake could mean starting over. Some monks never finished the books they began. And yet they kept going. Generation after generation, in monasteries that could only be reached by climbing ropes up cliff faces, Ethiopian monks continued turning pages and copying words that the rest of the world had either forgotten or never known. There is a monastery in the Ethiopian highlands called Abba Garima, and inside it, preserved in conditions that have barely changed in 15 centuries, are two illustrated gospel books known as the Garima Gospels. In 2010, radiocarbon dating confirmed what Ethiopian monks had been saying for generations. These manuscripts were created between 390 and 570 CE. Let that land for a moment. Imagine opening a book that was already ancient when Europe was entering the Dark Ages. Its pages are goat skin, prepared and dyed with natural pigments. Its colors have survived 15 centuries. Its illustrations depict scenes from the gospel narrative in a style that owes nothing to Byzantine or Roman artistic traditions, a style that is entirely, unmistakably Ethiopian. The Garima Gospels are older than the Book of Ge'ez, older than the Lindisfarne Gospels, older than virtually every decorated Bible that European Christianity has ever produced. They were not created to impress visitors or demonstrate wealth. One monk from the Garima tradition wrote, "To draw is to pray with the hand what the mouth cannot say." These books were acts of worship, each page a meditation, each illustration a prayer. And here is the thing that Western historiography has consistently downplayed. While the Garima Gospels were being created, Europe was collapsing. The Western Roman Empire was fragmenting. Literacy was plummeting. Libraries were burning. The period we call the Dark Ages was not dark everywhere, but it was genuinely dark across much of Europe. While that darkness was falling, Ethiopian Christians were producing illuminated manuscripts of remarkable sophistication. They had a literate clergy, an established literary tradition, a theological vocabulary capable of expressing complex ideas about the nature of God and the structure of reality, and an artistic culture producing masterworks of visual storytelling. This was not a peripheral outpost of Christianity struggling to keep up. This was a parallel civilization, fully formed, deeply rooted, and in many ways more intellectually alive in its preservation of early Christian thought than anything happening in Europe at the same time. While kingdoms rose and fell, Ethiopia waited. While libraries burned, Ethiopia copied. While other traditions debated which books belonged, Ethiopia kept reading them all. Which raises the question that the Mashafa Kidden forces into the open. If Ethiopia preserved everything, what exactly was inside? Let us talk about the books the Western canon removed. Not to make a villain of any institution, but because the details matter and most people have never been told them. The Book of Enoch, known in the Ethiopian tradition as First Enoch, was one of the most widely circulated texts in the ancient world. It was not a fringe document. It was not obscure. The Epistle of Jude, which appears in every Bible ever printed, contains a direct word-for-word citation from Enoch. Not a paraphrase. Not an allusion. A quotation from a book that Western Christianity would later decide was not scripture. Enoch was read by the earliest Christians. It was referenced by the Church Fathers. It shaped the apocalyptic imagination that produced the Book of Revelation. And then it was cut. The theological reasons given were real, but they were not the whole story. Enoch is a deeply visionary text. It describes the inner mechanics of heaven, the movements of celestial beings, the direct relationship between devoted human beings and the divine. It suggests that revelation is not exclusively institutional, that a sincere seeker might themselves encounter the sacred, without requiring an intermediary to sanction the experience. For an institution building its authority on the claim that it alone held the keys to salvation, this was genuinely complicated. The Book of Jubilees tells a similar story. It retells the narrative of Genesis, embedding within it a sacred calendar and a spiritual structure that frames all of history as a divine pattern, a mathematical and spiritual order that humans can learn to perceive. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, multiple copies of Jubilees were found among them, confirming it was a central text for Jewish communities in the centuries before and after Jesus. It was excluded from the Western canon. Too complex. Too empowering for individual believers who might start believing they could understand the structure of the divine without needing institutional guidance. Ethiopia kept both books, not as supplementary reading, not as interesting historical curiosities, but as core scripture. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church reads Enoch and Jubilees with the same canonical authority as Genesis or the Gospels. They are woven into the liturgical calendar, referenced in sermons, studied by monks. The monks who preserved these books were not making a political statement. They were not rebels protecting forbidden knowledge. They simply never received the memo telling them to stop reading. And because they never stopped, they maintained a version of Christianity that includes voices the rest of the world has not heard for over 1,000 years. Voices that speak about the nature of the soul, the structure of heaven, the possibility that every human being carries within them a fragment of divine light that is waiting to be recognized. These are not fringe ideas. They are the oldest ideas in Christianity. They just happen to survive in only one place. Now we return to the Mashafa Kidden. Because everything, the forgotten history, the ancient Gospels, the preserved books, all of it leads back to this single text and the question it forces into the open. In the Western tradition, the resurrection is an event. Full stop. It happened on a Sunday morning outside Jerusalem. A stone was rolled away. A tomb was empty. And the theological weight of the entire Christian faith rests on whether or not you believe that event occurred. Accept it and you are saved. Doubt it and you are lost. That is the framework. That has been the framework for 1,500 years. The Ethiopian tradition does not deny that the resurrection happened. But it asks something the Western framework almost never touches. What did it do to the people who witnessed it? What shifted inside them? And what was Jesus spending those 40 days teaching before he ascended? Because he clearly was not done. In the gospel accounts most Christians know, the resurrection is treated almost like a curtain call. Jesus rises, appears to a few people, gives a handful of instructions, descends. The story moves quickly, as though the writers were in a hurry to reach the ending. The Mashafa Kidden slows down. It lingers in those 40 days the way a careful filmmaker holds on a crucial scene that other directors would cut. And what it captures in that extended frame is a Jesus who is doing something the Western tradition almost entirely overlooks. He is not performing miracles to prove he is alive. He is not making public appearances to convince skeptics. He is teaching privately, intimately, directly. He is sitting with his closest followers and showing them how to see the world differently, not what to believe, but how to perceive. The distinction between those two things is the crack that splits the entire history of Christianity in half. The teachings in the Mashafa Kidden are not theological arguments. They are spiritual instructions. Jesus speaks of silence as a sacred practice, not the absence of sound, but an active discipline that opens a channel between the human mind and what the text describes as the living light. He describes prayer not as a list of requests directed at the sky, but as a repositioning of awareness that allows a person to receive what is already being given. He talks about perception as the real miracle, telling his followers that the eyes most people use are closed by fear, and that true sight comes from hearts opened by wonder. One passage reads, "You ask for proof, but I give you perception. You seek signs, but I give you stillness." That line alone is enough to reframe 15 centuries of theological debate. It suggests that the entire apparatus of evidence-based faith, the relics, the arguments, the desperate search for historical confirmation, was never the point. The point was transformation. The point was learning to see. The Mashafa Kidden describes the resurrection not as a finale but as an opening. The miracle was not the lesson. It was the door. What Jesus taught behind that door was a complete rewiring of human perception. He told his followers that most people move through the world blind, not physically, but blind by habit, by fear, by the heavy crust of assumptions about what is real. The text describes specific practices given during those 40 days. Silence as a discipline that opens an inner channel. Fasting as a thinning of the boundary between the physical body and what the text calls the body of light. Prayer as alignment, not petition. And one line captures everything in a single image. Those who walk after the sun but never see its light have not yet risen. You can spend your entire life surrounded by the sacred and never once perceive it. Resurrection in this tradition is the moment that blindness lifts. Not believing that light exists, actually seeing it. Not a transaction but a transformation. Not something that happened once in a tomb. Something that is waiting to happen inside every human being alive. What we are really looking at is a fork in the road that occurred almost 2,000 years ago. Christianity began as a single seed, planted in the same soil, carrying the same potential. But it grew in two very different directions, shaped by two very different environments. In Rome, Christianity grew under the weight of empire. It was adopted by a political system that needed unity, hierarchy, and coherence. The questions Rome asked of the faith were administrative questions. How do we unify belief under central authority? How do we ensure that every church in every province teaches the same doctrine? How do we prevent fragmentation? These are legitimate questions for an empire to ask. But they are not spiritual questions. And the answers they produced were administrative answers. Creeds, councils, a canon enforced from the top down, a standardized set of approved books and an approved way to read them. In Ethiopia, Christianity grew in isolation, in mountain monasteries that could only be reached by climbing ropes up cliff faces. The questions Ethiopia asked were entirely different. How do we encounter the sacred directly? How do we cultivate an inner life that is alive to the presence of God? How do we preserve every voice, every vision, every text that carries the weight of revelation, without presuming to judge which revelations are convenient? The answers Ethiopia produced were also different. Not creeds, but practices. Not centralized authority, but distributed devotion. Not a pruned canon, but a complete library. Fasting. Silence. Sunrise prayers. Chants that carry across mountain valleys at dawn. Liturgies that last for hours, performed not for an audience but for God alone. An Ethiopian priest once said something that captures the entire difference in a single sentence. The church is not made of stone. It is made of breath, fire, and water, like creation itself. That is not a metaphor. It is a description of a lived theology. A faith that is experienced in the body, in the rhythms of daily life, in the physical sensation of fasting and the audible resonance of sacred music. Western Christianity became organized. Ethiopian Christianity became embodied. Neither path is wrong, but only one of them preserved the complete archive. And now that the archive is being translated and studied, something is becoming clear. The version of the story the Western world received was not the whole story. It was the version that survived the editorial process of empire. It was coherent and powerful and durable, and it carried genuine spiritual truth, but it was also incomplete. The original, unedited, unfiltered version was up in the mountains the entire time, guarded by monks who never stopped copying, never stopped reading, never stopped believing that someday the rest of the world would be ready to hear what they had kept. There is a reason this resonates so deeply at this particular moment in history. Across the Western world, people are leaving organized religion in record numbers. Church attendance is declining. Institutional trust is collapsing. Denominations that once filled cathedrals are now struggling to fill parking lots. But the remarkable thing is that most of these people are not becoming atheists. They are not rejecting the sacred. They are rejecting the container. They are walking away from formulas, from doctrines they are told to accept without question, from institutions that demand belief but offer no experience. They are looking for something they cannot quite name but can feel the absence of. They want depth. They want encounter. They want transformation, not just information. They want to be changed by their faith, not merely categorized by it. And here, preserved in manuscripts 1,500 years old, is exactly what they are looking for. The Ethiopian tradition offers practices, not just propositions. It offers silence, fasting, sacred breath, alignment with natural rhythms. It offers a vision of faith that is not about what you agree to believe on Sunday morning, but about how you learn to see on every other day of the week. It offers a Jesus who is not a historical figure to be argued about, but a living presence to be encountered. It offers resurrection not as a claim requiring your assent, but as a call requiring your transformation. As one theologian recently observed, the future of faith may look more like Ethiopia's past. Not rigid, not dogmatic, but rhythmic, visionary, and deeply embodied. A faith that does not ask what do you believe, but asks instead how do you see. For millions of people who have left the building but not the search, that question is everything. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these manuscripts is not what they say. It is the fact that they survived it all. Through wars. Through empires. Through centuries of neglect by a Western world that was busy looking elsewhere. While kingdoms collapsed and libraries burned and councils voted and centuries passed, a handful of monks in the Ethiopian highlands kept turning pages. They kept copying words by hand, by candlelight, in languages almost nobody else could read. They climbed cliff faces with manuscripts on their backs. They spent years on single books they would never see finished. They preserved voices that the rest of the world had forgotten or had been too incurious to ever seek out. And now, after nearly 2,000 years, the world is finally listening. The question the Mashafa Kitten leaves you with is not a theological question. It is a personal one. If resurrection was never meant to be a miracle you witness from a distance, but a process you live from the inside, what would that require of you? Not what would you believe? What would you have to be willing to see? That question has been sitting in a mountain monastery, written in a language almost nobody could read, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. It is still waiting.